Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever in the world that you may be joining us from. My name is Monde Mayangwa, the Director of the Africa Program at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of the Africa Program and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, I would like to welcome everyone to this discussion on China's soft power projection in Africa. We are delighted that you can join us for this very important discussion. China's presence in Africa is not new, as it has been on the continent for a very long time. For example, China established official relationships with Zambia in 1964, right after Zambia gained its independence, and was engaged in a life-saving infrastructure project in Zambia in the 1970s. What is different is the fact that China's engagement has expanded rapidly over the last couple of decades to cover more countries, to deepen its engagement in the economic and other spheres. And this engagement evokes many different reactions as well as questions about China's strategic objectives on the continent, the pros and cons of its involvement in Africa's economic development, including and especially resource extraction, trade, infrastructure development, and increasingly the debt question on the continent. There are also questions, or an increasing number of questions about China's impact on democracy and good governance on the African continent. The aforementioned elements of China's engagement with Africa have received the vast majority of scholarly and policy attention, while the soft power dimensions of its strategy on the continent has received less attention. For example, what we have seen over the last couple of decades is that China's education and media outreach programs have also grown significantly. We have Confucius Institutes that have spread to more countries. We have scholarships that are offered to African students, and we also have an increasing number of media trainings that are offered to various African countries. Another dimension that does not often receive as much attention is that while official-to-official relations and the great power competition question has dominated the discourse, the views of ordinary Africans are often overlooked in these discussions about China's engagement in Africa, particularly around the soft power elements. The Kissinger Institute and the Africa Program are therefore pleased to collaborate today to host two scholars who have devoted a significant amount of their research to understanding and analyzing Chinese soft power in Africa. And it is now my pleasure to turn over the Zoom microphone to my colleague and friend, Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute, to add to my remarks, introduce the speakers, and to moderate the discussion. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Monde. And I want to say that it's just a real pleasure to finally be working together with the Africa Program on a public event of this kind. The Africa Program and the Kissinger Institute are on the same floor of the Wilson Center. And we've had a rich, deep dialogue for many years about Africa, China, US relations, but it's mostly been confined to our own hallways. We haven't brought it to the Wilson Center audience. We've been a little delinquent in that, but this is the beginning of a new effort driven by our excellent scholars, two of whom are with us today. So really, Monde, I look forward to a much deeper, constant collaboration with you and your great team at the Africa Program. Thank you. As Monde said, the question of China's propaganda, soft power, influence operations in Africa is usually treated in Washington as an aspect of a growing great power competition between the United States and China, as though Africa were simply a passive blank slate upon which these great powers would carry out their competition. That's not how we're going to come at this at the Wilson Center. We want to begin with Africa itself, its needs, its responses to the powers today, particularly to China. And so we are very glad to have as our guides to this topic, first, Dr. Maria Repnikova, who is a scholar of Chinese politics and assistant professor of global communication at Georgia State University, where her research focuses on China's domestic and global public opinion management, its internal propaganda, and most recently, China's efforts to use soft, or what are sometimes called sharp power tools. I'll let her characterize those within Africa. Dr. Repnikova is a current Wilson Fellow with both the Kissinger Institute and the Africa Program, and she will lead off today with extended remarks on China's visions and practices for expanding its influence within Africa, the mixed results of those efforts, and the implications of that relationship going forward. We are then delighted to have Dr. Emmanuel Matambo to add his own thoughts on these topics, as well as some responses to Dr. Repnikova. Dr. Matambo is Research Director at the University of Johannesburg's Center for Africa-China Studies. He has published many academic articles on a range of topics: conflict resolution, contemporary terrorist issues, education theory, and African agency. But his main interest now, his scholarly focus, is on China-Africa relations. He was a 2019 fellow at the Wilson Center, where his research focused on constructing China's identity in Africa. It was a case study of China-Zambia relations. So with that, we will go first to Dr. Repnikova, and then to Dr. Matambo, and then to questions from everyone here on the screen, but also from all of you. So please start sending questions as soon as you have them. Send them to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. Wilson Center is one word, no gap between Wilson and Center. Again, please send questions to china@wilsoncenter.org. And we'll be very glad to bring you into the conversation. Thank you again, Monday. And with that, Maria, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Thank you again for the kind introduction, Robert and Dr. Monde, for both of you for hosting me this year. It's been a wonderful year despite the pandemic. And I only wish that Dr. Matambo was also here in person so we could interact more on our joint research agendas. So I'm going to give some remarks about Chinese soft power visions and efforts in Africa from my current research project, and some discussion of the reception as well, that I find to be quite mixed and conflicted. And then, turn it over to Dr. Matambo to discuss and comment and offer his own research findings that I think will be very valuable. So to start with, despite China's increasing economic and military might or hard power, the Chinese party state has long pursued an ambitious agenda of improving its image, or soft power, the concept that borrowed from Joseph Nye and readapted for its domestic context. In fact, some of you might be surprised to learn that the most enthusiastic audience of Joseph Nye's idea of soft power has not been the US government, but the Chinese government, as Chinese leaders have realized that there's a gap between China's negative global image and its rising economic prowess. They exhibited relentless curiosity and even obsession with soft power. Some Chinese experts even suggest that China's great power status is contingent upon it capturing more of what they describe as, quote, discourse power, or the right to speak in the international system. Academic and policy journals in China that I've examined have published over 7,000 articles in Chinese on this topic alone. The concept cultural soft power has been repeatedly featured at high-level leadership meetings, especially under Xi Jinping. Xi also urged Chinese media to better, quote, tell the China story and embrace the more proactive stance in the international system, including in the realm of information politics. Beyond just official narratives, the Chinese party state has been spending an estimated $10 billion a year on public diplomacy. For comparison, the US government spends about $2.19 billion, and this number hasn't increased significantly over the past decade. Western academics, policymakers, and journalists have at once dismissed these efforts as ineffective and expressed fears that echo the narratives of the Cold War. Many experts argue that China has a soft power deficit, largely due to weak moral appeal of the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, since 2017 and the coinage of the term, quote, sharp power in reference to China and Russia, the discussions have shifted into portraying Chinese soft power as a threat. The DoD funding has shifted from terrorism to countering China and Russia's global influence. Many policy statements directly invoke the rhetoric of, quote, the new Cold War, and the militaristic jargon of, quote, influence operations. And even publications like The New Yorker have described China as a moral adversary. This anxiety about China as a rival for values and international leadership is especially striking in Africa, the continent that has historically served as a stage of moral theater between geopolitical competitors like the US, USSR, and China during the Cold War. In the past 2 decades, China's engagement with the continent has significantly expanded, as was already noted by Dr. Monde, from economic relations, including large-scale investments, loans, and trade, into the more soft power realm that includes media, education, and culture, amongst other spheres. This image work appears to be in response to widespread critiques in Western media and policy circles, but also in African media and civil society about debt trap diplomacy, neocolonialism, and associations of China with imperial behavior. The Chinese government has invested heavily in overturning these narratives. China is now the #1 training destination for African elites, including journalists. About 1,000 of them get trained in China every year. It hosts the largest number of African students in the world, estimated at 80,000 a year. US in comparison hosts about 40,000 a year, so half of that number. China has launched 62 Confucius Institutes teaching Chinese language and culture on the continent. China's state-owned media has opened headquarters in Nairobi that distribute content to many other countries. In addition to the state-driven soft power efforts, there are also commercial efforts that tap into the party's soft power agenda, such as communication infrastructure provision by companies like Huawei and ZTE, including the 5G provision, but also digital TV access and cheap smartphone sales, amongst other products and services, as well as the construction of major public infrastructure like railroads, highways, stadiums, and government buildings. In Addis Ababa, for instance, the African Union building was built by a Chinese company. These initiatives have been associated with propaganda, ideological infiltration, and authoritarian diffusion in US policy discussions. In this analysis, African countries and publics are often treated as passive and even experimental audiences in China's quest for global influence. And yet, whereas China's controversial economic reach into the African continent has been examined extensively, and in particular the notion of debt trap diplomacy, and here I refer to Deborah Brodikam's work at SAIS, especially, who debunked some of these myths and written about this in wider policy circles. But when it comes to soft power outreach, I think it still remains little understood, especially when it comes to China's visions, practices, and the complex reception on the ground. Today, I would like to introduce this in some depth, drawing on my research on Chinese soft power in Ethiopia, which has been my main case study in the past several years, but also interviews with African elites and students who attended trainings and graduate studies in China that I've interacted with in my time in Beijing and other Chinese cities, and Chinese officials, experts, and teachers who work in Africa. The key argument or theme that emerges from my research so far, and that I want to underscore today, is that China's soft power efforts in Africa are at once impressive and significant and highly contested, something that I refer to my work as in my work as a fragmented spectacle. The appeal of Chinese soft power efforts is rooted in China's accessibility and large-scale offerings to tangible benefits. And yet, the reception towards these initiatives is mixed. An embrace of practical opportunities, but not necessarily a deeper trust or desire for China. There are also important distinctions in how these offerings are viewed across different societal levels and different countries that are worth examining. I start off by explaining China's soft power appeal or offerings, and then focus on the varieties of reception that I observe on the ground. So first of all, when it comes to attraction of scale, when it comes to Africa, the Chinese authorities have made a deliberate effort to emphasize their moral vision vis-a-vis the continent as that of mutuality and win-win, and generosity as the underlying foundation of China's soft power. In material terms, this means extensive resources invested into communicating with and creating new bonds of affinity with African publics, especially elites. At the last FOCAC meeting, Xi Jinping promised 50,000 new training opportunities, as well as continuing expansion of other people-to-people ties, from youth summits to student scholarships. In practice, in the context of Ethiopia, I find that in contrast to the US approach that emphasizes abstract values and ideals of liberal democracy, but commits limited investments into educational cultural programs, Chinese cultural, educational, and media programs focus on access, or presenting China as a real and tangible opportunity. When it comes to official trainings, the large quotas, numbered in thousands a year for Ethiopia alone, make them a relatively common occurrence. They are targeted towards institutions and individuals strategic for Sino-African, and in my case, Sino-Ethiopian relations, such as members of the ruling party, key government agencies, but also state-owned media and civil servants training academies. And yet, because of the relatively large quotas, many others, not necessarily directly engaged in Ethio-China relations, get to go as well. During my research, I even heard rumors that officials send their secretaries on trainings as a reward for their hard work, or send friends who need to purchase certain items like medicine or clothing in China. The acceptance process, or the bureaucracy of this kind of training acceptance, is also very straightforward, and at times even a little comical. One participant, a journalist at a major news agency in Addis Ababa, recounts an interview questions following the following model. Do you want to go to China? Do you like China? Can you speak English okay? The journalist pulled out a photograph of Mao Zedong's home village he visited outside of Changsha in Hunan during his previous short trip, also fully funded by China. I love China, he exclaimed. The officer smiled and swiftly approved his paperwork. This, of course, is a comical representation, but many others, including Chinese officials themselves, noted that this process is fairly swift and not especially intensive when it comes to checking over the candidates. China's Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms, located on Ethiopian university campuses, offer free Chinese lessons for any student and staff. And in the case of Ethiopia, also low-priced lessons for members of the city community, including drivers, cooks, waiters, and engineers who work with Chinese firms and officials. Chinese media is physically disseminated across the city with free copies of China Daily, China's main kind of international newspaper, piled up in hotels, delivered to university presidents and other administrators, and plugged into print editions of some Ethiopian newspapers. Xinhua News Agency, China's main news agency, proudly provides the Ethiopian news agency free access to its international news database. This technique of what I describe in my work as, quote, information flooding is increasingly widespread beyond Africa. A report just released by the International Federation of Journalists, for instance, uncovered that during the pandemic, Chinese content has increasingly been filtered into the local media ecosystem across regional contexts. From Serbia to Italy, where 50 Xinhua News articles per day are carried on the news wire of Italian ANSA News Agency. Major Chinese infrastructure projects such as road, railway, light rail, and airport construction are visible throughout major cities, with bright labels often in Chinese, but now also in Amharic and English, signaling that these projects are constructed and funded by the Chinese government. The straightforward access to Chinese soft power offerings, especially educational opportunities, is often contrasted with the more obscure and what is perceived as exclusive access to opportunities in the United States. During interviews and group discussions, the application process to either the YALI Fellowship, the flagship US government fellowship for young African leaders, or prestigious US journalism fellowships would often come up. After skimming through the requirements, including fluency in English language, a personal essay, and a list of prior accomplishments, many would quickly give up. Conditioned by the ease of China access, my Ethiopian interlocutors were left disappointed with what they often refer to as, quote, the closed door of the United States. Beyond access or the ease of participation, Chinese soft power also carries or comes with certain tangible benefits. For instance, whereas official trainings are often associated with authoritarian diffusion and policy debates here in Washington, my close analysis of these programs finds that it's more of a showing off exercise of China. Chinese organizers create a structured courtship experience, much of it focused on consumption of modernity, visits to various sites from high-speed rail to major cities to the redeveloped villages, to cultural sites, and of course, shopping or consumption of material goods themselves as part of this trip. The lectures themselves tend to focus on China's economic success story, much less so on the ideological story of the superiority of socialism and the rule of the one-party state. In fact, the party is generally presented as more democratic and inclusive, rather than as a model for authoritarianism, suggesting that these materials speak more to Western critiques of China indirectly via African participants. What these trainings offer participants is less so ideational content, as was the case with trainings under Mao, and more so a chance to experience economic development, but also a form of entertainment, distraction, adventure. In fact, many of my interviewees refer to these trips as, quote, a picnic. Despite critiquing much of the content as being useless or somewhat inapplicable to their professional lives, when asked whether they would go on this trip again, one of the journalists said, why would I miss a picnic? Or as another interviewee noted, it's better to see China than to see nothing, as he went about lobbying for more Chinese journalist fellowships for his news agency at the Chinese embassy. Confucius Institutes, highly controversial in the West, increasingly shutting down in the US and Europe. In Africa, especially in countries with high economic presence of Chinese companies, present much more than cultural exchange, but also educational and employment opportunities. According to officials I spoke to at Hamban, the former headquarters of CIs, these initiatives are most dynamic in Africa. In Ethiopia, the only foreign language that still sees high enrollments other than English is Chinese. In response to my question to the Register Office manager and university deans as to why other languages, including European languages and Russian, have zero enrollments over the past several years, the answer is simple. There are no jobs. Beyond simply alluding to jobs as a possibility, some Confucius Institutes and classrooms that I visited even carry out job interviews in their offices and link students up with contracts at Chinese companies in Ethiopia. Students celebrate some major Chinese holidays at Chinese company headquarters, and company representatives come to speak at cultural events and at job fairs on university campuses. As the latest co-director of the Addis Ababa University CI told me, Chinese promote themselves with every tool possible, amazed at their proactive attitudes. For now, these promotion efforts also have tangible results. Many Chinese language speakers are hired as translators for Chinese companies and paid double to triple the salary of university professors and deans. Media partnerships include free access to databases, I already mentioned, Xinhua News database, media infrastructure such as digital TV access, as well as some revenue when it comes to inserting Chinese media into local newspapers. But also on a more symbolic level, a deliberately positive portrayal of Africa via Chinese media for global audiences is something that's practiced by Chinese media, something that some Chinese journalists also link to possible economic advantages for African nations. The head of the Xinhua News Bureau in Addis Ababa, for instance, shared with me with a notable pride how when one of his colleagues from the agency traveled to Russia, the Russian counterparts commented that they learned about Africa through Xinhua reporting, not through Western media. This exposure, in the bureau chief's view, can yield more attraction and investment in Africa in the long term. Of course, that's debatable, but that's his point of view. Ethiopian elites I interviewed are welcoming of this positive narrative and representation of Africa, often lamenting about negative depictions by Western media outlets. Declarations of friendship at large are often combined with material gifts, such as medical equipment or vaccine diplomacy in the current moment of the pandemic. According to Wall Street Journal reporting from Addis Ababa, in a week of February 21st alone, 1 million of Chinese government-backed doses passed through Addis Ababa airport destined for Ethiopia and surrounding nations. In other words, when it comes to China's soft power in Africa, it is not just about culture or values, and neither is it all about ideology incursion. Chinese soft power vision molds together the material and cultural and positions itself as both accessible and tangible. The scale of China's soft power outreach is often associated with its effectiveness, especially in policy reports like the recent IFJ report on Chinese media, as well as recent reporting on COVID vaccine diplomacy. As long as China is providing or doing a lot, it's often considered to be kind of a victory over the West or over the United States. But the reception towards Chinese soft power initiatives is mixed and even contradictory. Chinese soft power initiatives are effective in enticing participation and even inspiration among some participants, but not necessarily deeper affinity and trust towards China, especially at the societal level, even in nations that are closely aligned with China politically and economically, like Ethiopia. As for participation, very few individuals and institutions that I've encountered over several years of this research would refuse China's soft power offerings, especially government institutions and employees, including state media outlets, but also universities when it comes to Confucius Institutes. The main draw or attraction to these initiatives isn't their tangible benefits introduced earlier in my remarks. In fact, in contrast to the portrayals of African audiences and elites as passive or coerced into these engagements, I find Ethiopian elites are often the ones initiating China's soft power encounters by lobbying for more trainings, Chinese language teachings, and media partnerships. Often they're the ones actually initiating this relationship, not vice versa. When it comes to shifting perceptions about China, the most effective mechanism is that of direct immersion into China via short-term training visits. The participants tend to describe these as, quote, inspirational, especially in terms of witnessing China's immense developmental accomplishments via carefully curated visits organized by the Chinese hosts. One participant described his encounter with Shanghai as a city as something that really had shook him, as he discovered that Shanghai is very similar, when it comes to major cities similar to New York or Paris or any other kind of global metropolis. He didn't expect to see China being as developed. He used kind of a cooking metaphor in talking about China, that it's as if China kind of closed the door, was preparing this grand feast, and now it opened the door for everyone to witness it. For him, that was a very important experience and something that he took away from the trip. At the same time, participation and even a sentiment of inspiration in China's development progress should not be equated with indoctrination or even successful cooptation of these initiatives, nor with immersive cultural exchange. The visits to China, whether short-term or long-term, don't appear to transpire in deeper trust for Chinese initiatives in Africa. This is in part because through these visits, the participants also learn the sharp edges of the Chinese system, manifested in unwillingness of the hosts to engage with contentious issues. A good example of that kind of engagement was given to me by an official in Ethiopia who asked about the environmental impact of Chinese companies in Ethiopia. The response he got from his Chinese host was, "Are you coming from the United States?" He was quite, persistent in pushing for his question and said, "No, I'm coming from Ethiopia and I want to know the answer." The response was silence. And he repeated over and over that oftentimes when asking complicated questions, contentious questions about Chinese involvement in Africa in the economic domain, especially when it comes to environment, human rights, corruption, the response is literally to ignore the question. And that's something that leaves many with unease, privately questioning to what extent the, quote, win-win is equal or more skewed towards China. In my lectures across Ethiopia, one of the dominant themes was that of the Sino-Ethiopian relationship being unequal and concerns about negotiating better terms. Even the presentation of Chinese political system by Chinese hosts as a democracy that's inclusive and meritocratic gets questioned by participants privately. Although publicly they expressed agreement with Chinese hosts, privately, many return with conflicted thoughts as to what extent China really is more open than Ethiopia. Some even express pity for the lack of freedoms available to their Chinese counterparts, including media professionals. The language and cultural exchanges in Confucius Institutes are more rooted in strategic benefits than in deeper cultural immersion. Ethiopian university deans accept collaboration with CIs because of employment prospects, but share bluntly that if material benefits were to dry out, they would immediately shut down the institutes. While many students are attracted to Chinese culture as part of the learning process, the most attractive feature is the employment and scholarship opportunity associated with the study of Chinese. The actual cultural immersion of teachers into Ethiopian society is also very limited. Most live in very close compounds and lead isolated lives, where they would go back to their compounds around 5 o'clock, make their meals, and only associate or socialize amongst themselves. In fact, they're not allowed to really socialize outside of their community. And Ethiopian students learn little about Chinese culture beyond the traditional culture aspects taught at CIs. As Dr. Matambo also critically reflected in his Wilson Center report, CIs are relatively one-directional enterprises, with Chinese teaching about their culture and language, but less so learning from and about Africa. In fact, before coming to Africa, they get very little training, a very general training, and very little training about the specific country they're going to, which makes them kind of ill-equipped to deal with local society. This one-directionality is also present in other soft power mechanisms. And when it comes to media initiatives, while Ethiopian media enter into agreements and collaboration with Chinese outlets, the actual resonance of Chinese media content, even amongst media professionals, thus far appears to be relatively limited. Media professionals would comment that the content is kind of predictable, and many have never even heard of Chinese media like CGTN and China Daily amongst the wider public. In countries with more extensive Chinese media presence, including Kenya and South Africa, recent studies by scholars like Wasserman and Morales find limited reception, even amongst journalists, in part because of suspicions about credibility of Chinese media, a concern more acutely expressed in the West. Chinese soft power initiatives from trainings to CIs to media, therefore, are met with a mix of opportunistic embrace, alienation, and distrust. In analyzing reception, it's also important to distinguish between elite and mass societal layers. Whereas elite reception of China's soft power offerings, at least on the surface, is more positive, although they reflect critically on China in private. At the public level, there is more widespread suspicion and critique. In more democratic or open societies, this critique manifests itself in more public form, including protests and critical media reporting. A recent study published in European Economic Review found that the increase in number and financing of Chinese projects in Africa in democratic societies spurs protests and other forms of participation. Of course, this is kind of a provocation that needs further exploration, but it's interesting to think about this further. And whereas in Ethiopia, most media reports on China and Confucius Institutes of Chinese culture are largely positive. In Zambia, for instance, the 2019 column that I found in Lusaka Times presents Confucius Institutes as a control instrument, comparing China to former colonial powers. An article in Kenya Tribune from 2019 as well is similarly titled as, quote, language and culture are instruments for expansion of Chinese empire. Even in more politically closed societies like Ethiopia, there is a sharp contrast between elite and popular perceptions of China. In my routine encounters with lay citizens, from taxi drivers to hotel employees, chefs, engineers, and construction workers, China and Chinese projects were quickly dismissed and critiqued for their perceived, quote, low quality. A taxi driver would share that Chinese roads are flooded during the race season. Hotel employees would complain about China-made television sets turning on their own accord during the night, something I experienced while staying in this hotel. And market workers would vent about traditional Ethiopian clothing now being made in China and sold at a fraction of the price, but at much lower quality, endangering the traditional Ethiopian handcraft. Rather than expressing a sentiment of gratitude towards China, the projects are interpreted as a high cost to Ethiopian society, and the presence of Chinese employees is seen as imposing and even threatening, especially the emergence of so-called Chinatown in Addis Ababa. So how do we think about this contradictory performance of Chinese soft power in Africa? I want to continue now to some implications. First, in thinking about its effectiveness, I think we need to consider the different aims of the Chinese Communist Party in engaging with this in the soft power initiatives. If the goal is to primarily target elites and to incite symbolic allegiance with China, they can also translate into political capital, such as votes at the UN and economic capital in the form of more contracts for Chinese companies, then Chinese soft power outreach, I would argue, is relatively effective. On the surface, many elites, especially in my case study of Ethiopia, express positive sentiments and a collaborative rhetoric vis-a-vis China, rarely criticizing anything about this relationship in public. If the goal is to legitimize the Chinese Communist Party rule domestically, which is one of the aims of Chinese soft power, through the narratives of China's success in Africa, then these soft power engagements are also relatively effective. The numerous interviews of African elites, the Chinese media, and the larger story of China as helping and saving Africa resonates domestically, although there's still critique amongst Chinese public and suspicion about China's spending externally when more policy areas are in need of the government attention domestically. But nonetheless, the story is being recorded in much detail for domestic audiences. If the goal, however, is to create deeper trust and affinity with China, or to seriously transform the image of China on the ground, especially at the public level, and to close this gap between kind of the rise of China as an economic power and its sort of negative image amongst various societies, then these soft power offerings appear to be less effective. The results are more ambiguous. This distinction fusion of material and cultural power, this kind of combination of offering something that's very tangible and trying to sell Chinese culture as part of that, also puts into question the sustainability of China's soft power engagements. Material enticement translates into rising expectations, And higher visibility of Chinese projects also means higher reputational costs when something goes wrong. When a Chinese-built road is flooded, for instance, the first actor blamed is China, not the Ethiopian government that's actually responsible for maintaining these projects. And when it comes to vaccine, for instance, diplomacy, there's so much talk now about the scale of distribution of the vaccine, but the quality of the vaccine is being questioned. It's not clear how effective Chinese vaccine actually is in comparison to its competitors. So over time, it takes time to determine how effective are these kind of fusions of material endearment and products and enticements and actual attraction to China. How does it actually work, especially if these products end up being critiqued for their inconsistent quality? I think that's something that's very important, not only for Africa, but for the rest of the world where China is engaged very actively now. So when it comes to implications for US policy in Africa, I want to conclude with several points. I think my research here demonstrates that Chinese soft power engagements are to be taken seriously, especially its mix of material and cultural kind of combination of offerings. This is not unique to Africa. A recent Financial Times report found that China is leading by far the US and other nations, for instance, in vaccine provision across Latin America. This was associated in this report with kind of a win, again, for China's soft power. Rather than focusing solely or primarily on the ideological facet of this battle, it's also important to look at the pragmatic or material side of China's soft power enticement. Competition means not solely competing for ideas, but also in providing opportunities, especially in the education sphere, where I think there's a lot of space for competition and collaboration. Second, while Chinese efforts in Africa are significant, it's also important to note that the US remains part of this relationship, of this conversation. It's often invoked in interviews and discussions. In particular, the US remains the preferred option when it comes to education, media, and cultural experiences, according to my research on the ground. But also to recent Afrobarometer survey that found that the US development model is still preferred to China's, but this gap is quickly narrowing. This means that there is significant opportunity for the US engagement on the continent, but this engagement will be better framed if catered to the interest of Africans themselves, rather than formulated as a competition against China. As noted, I think throughout my remarks, it's often African elites that are initiating these interactions and actively negotiating, pushing back, and also redefining the terms. So they should be seen as active negotiators and deal makers rather than kind of as passive audiences in this relationship. Finally, any examination of Chinese soft power in Africa, any kind of thinking and analysis of this phenomenon, has to take into account China's larger global soft power effort. While Africa is significant, a larger proportion of public diplomacy spending is targeting the United States and neighboring countries. In fact, most of the emphasis of Chinese scholars, researchers, and policymakers when it comes to soft power is not on Africa, but it's on the US, its main rival, competitor, and kind of an obsessive in some ways, competitor in their remarks, but also when it comes to resources, the resources are expanding vis-a-vis the United States. Recent data on vaccine distribution also found that Asia Pacific received the most Chinese vaccines and Africa received the least. So again, it's important to put this kind of into larger context. So when we think about all these initiatives, we have to make sure not to exaggerate kind of an overblow also Chinese activities and to place them into this kind of larger global conversation about Chinese soft power. Thank you so much. I look forward to further conversation and remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Repnikova. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please send them to us via email. The address is china@wilsoncenter.org, china@wilsoncenter.org. Okay, Dr. Matambo, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Please allow me to express my gratitude for this invitation. And yeah, it's good to see my former colleagues, Dr. Miangwa, Robert. I remember I met Robert. We had a pleasant discussion, and then Ray, Gamu, and the rest of the staff members there. So thank you very much. And yeah, thanks to Dr. Maria Repnikova for that in-depth discussion, presentation, because at least it will help me to build, my presentation will be a build on what she has presented. So I will first actually agree totally with what she said about the importance that China puts on soft power, a theory that actually came from Professor Nai. And the most important components of soft power obviously are culture, values, and ideals. And China has been trying to use that not only to sponsor its worldview, so to say, but then to create a semblance of understanding, especially amongst its partners. Now, the first time when China really put soft power at the center of its diplomacy, I think it has always done that, but the first time that it did that, even in rhetoric, was in October 2017 at the 19th Congress of the of the Communist Party of China, when President Xi Jinping, allow me to quote him directly here, said, "We will improve our capacity to tell our stories and present a multidimensional view and enhance China's cultural soft power." And he termed this as soft power with Chinese characteristics. And that is a usual way of actually framing a lot of what China does. And then he says China will be a global leader in national strength and international influence. So we see here now a China that is bullish, a China that is very confident, not a China that has always been timid, because before the accession of President Xi Jinping to the presidency, we saw a China that was very reluctant to call itself as a power, but as a superpower in the making of some sort. But then with the accession of President Xi Jinping, we saw the rhetoric change, with him saying we want a military power that can not only fight, for example, but also win battles on the ground. So that is just the seismic shift, so to say, in terms of China's rhetoric and its behavior. And we have seen even its maneuverings now on the South China Sea and all that kind of stuff. So we see a China that is kind of confident here. Now, how important is soft power, especially in Africa? Well, China has realized that after 2013, they started talking about the new normal, where they are not going to aim at a frenetic pace of economic growth as it was in the first 40 years from 1978 to 2008. But then they now looked at a growth that would be much slower than the 9.5% that they had sustained for more than 3 decades, but a growth that is more sustainable, even if it will be at a slower level. And this is a growth that deals with innovation and stuff like that. And in 2019, a German insurer called Allianz actually released a report saying China might tone down in terms of its trade investment and lending to Africa, because it has also issues of its own internal debt. It owes its overall share of debt to the G20 countries, for example, increased from 45% in 2013 to about 63% in 2019. So that will, of course, cause a shift in China's investment and trade on the continent. But that, of course, will enhance, on the other hand, the importance of soft power lending on the African continent. Now, what strategies that China used? Dr. Repnikova has alluded to some of these strategies that China uses, such as the media. That has been very important and effective in China, because as I quoted from President Xi Jinping, to tell stories, the media is the most effective tool for doing that. And in countries like Zambia, for example, China through the Star Times of China has embarked on a venture called Top Star, a collaboration initiative with the Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, ZNBC, which is our state-owned enterprise in Zambia. And China's Top Star owns 60% of that venture, and the Zambian government owns only 40%. Now, here is an embarrassing fact. The Zambian government could not raise that 40%, and China loaned the Zambian government that 40% through the China Export-Import Bank, the Exim Bank. So the revenue as it stands right now is 100% Chinese. And then, of course, Topstar says it is only a content distributor, but the Media Owners Association of Zambia says, I think it might also try to influence not only the distribution of the content, but the substance of the. So that is one of the strategies that China is using, and it has caused quite a concerned view and reaction from popular views in Zambia, and of course from the civil societies in Zambia. So the media is one of them, and through the media, not only through media ventures such as Topstar, but also through the co-option, because China uses co-option, cooperation, and induction inducements in order to improve its soft power. And co-opting journalists has been very effective as well. There are some seasoned journalists who have now started working for the China Global Television Network. Dr. Nikova alluded to that as well. They have the CGTN has its African headquarters in Nairobi. I am very lucky to have visited that particular facility as well. So that as well has seen a huge number of journalists working full-time and also on a part-time basis for CGTN and other Chinese television networks. And then, of course, China never seizes an opportunity to tell us Africans the importance that it puts on Africa, as in contrast to what the Western media do. For example, in CGTN, every day, it apportions about 2 hours of its reportage to its focus on Africa. Now, BBC, on the other hand, for example, it's focused on Africa. I think it's 30 minutes in a week. So you could just imagine the importance that China wants to put to that particular contrast. And as Africans, of course, would be amenable to someone that we think pays more attention to us. And of course, through its non-interference, through its policy of non-interference, I call it policy of non-interference in inverted commas, because I don't believe that there is a totally unqualified diplomacy in the world. I don't think that exists, but it has been very effective in calming the fears of Africa. And it comes, there's a substantial difference between that and the West comes in the words of Henry Kissinger, actually, against whom Robert's institution is named. Professor Kissinger, in his book, 2011 publication called On China, he said the substantial difference between the United States diplomacy and China's diplomacy is that the United States diplomacy is missionary. It has a missionary zealotry about it. And it is morally generalizable. The United States would want to say our values are actually generalizable values. China, on the other hand, says its diplomacy, that is Dr. Kissinger, China's diplomacy, on the other hand, is cultural. So it has a relativist bent to it of saying, well, we cannot really dictate what our partners are going to, what our partners, the path that our partners choose to follow. It could be political path or ideological path and stuff like that. So that is a major difference. Now, to an African audience, that appears as though China is more tolerant of alternative views, whilst the United States, is very rigid in its diplomacy, and that has worked actually to win African minds at that particular stage there. And of course, apart from that, Dr. Repnikova talked about China's infrastructure investments on the continent. Those are material infrastructure investments that she linked to soft power, and that is very important to China. In 2018, China funded $45 million United dollars for the construction of the Julius Nyerere Memorial Academy in Tanzania. Now, this is a very important academy because it is an academy that was formed by the former liberation movements of Southern Africa. These are the liberation movements that worked in close concert with China towards the end of African colonialism and also settler rule in Rhodesia, which is today called Zimbabwe, and in apartheid South Africa at that time. So through infrastructure such as those ones, China is really gaining a lot of converts in Africa, but at the political level, and I'll come back to that. Now, what are the benefits of China's soft power in Africa? The benefits of China's soft power, I will again refer to what Dr. Repnikova said, is that the byproducts or the main products of this will actually result in tangible benefits, not only for Africa, but for China itself. Africa is an emerging market. It is a young continent with about a median age of about 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, we have countries like Nigeria that are burgeoning in population. By 2050, Nigeria is projected to overtake the United States in terms of its demographics. So this is a continent whereas in China, population is decreasing, in Africa, the population is actually going the opposite direction. So it has a great potential in terms of its market for China. Of course, notwithstanding the risks, we cannot totally overlook the risks that Africa comes with. Another importance that Africa has for China is China's way of diplomacy. Prior to the year 2000, China's diplomacy in Africa was mostly consigned to the level of political elites and diplomats. Even the people that built the Tanzania-Zambia railway line that Dr. Myango talked about, they went back to China at the termination of their contracts. But today it's totally different. Some people whose contracts from national corporations have terminated choose to remain in Africa because they've seen a niche through which they can further their economic advancement. So now, we have seen there's a shift now from this kind of diplomacy confined to state level diplomacy to a diplomacy that is named as, I don't know, Robert, who is fluent in Mandarin, could help me, but it's a Chinese word called guangxi, where a relationship is not only about state level formal relationship, but it is also about building personal relationships with not only African politicians, but it's also with first ladies. That is actually a growing trend in Africa. A lot of first ladies have organizations, and China now is collaborating more with first ladies to just show that it is no longer confined to the state level. So through that as well, we've seen that China is also working in close collaboration with civil societies, and that to some extent has actually been very, very successful. And of course, another importance to Africa is diplomacy. Africa forms, I think, the biggest voting bloc at the United Nations. It was crucial in letting China into the United Nations Security Council in 1971. So that has not been forgotten on by China. And of course, soft power is kind of used as well to make sure that that particular diplomacy in Africa is reassured. That is why countries like South Africa, for example, has been very instrumental in either siding with China on most terms, or it chooses to be neutral and to abstain whenever it comes to crucial votes. And that has been because of China's inroads in Africa through Huawei. It has been enlisted by South Africa to help with the rolling out of the 5G, and of course the effect of the Chinese Confucius Institutes here in South Africa. We have seen that there is a lot of close collaboration, not only between South African universities and Chinese universities, but also at the political level. Now, the reception has been mixed. The reception of China's soft power has been mixed, as Dr. Repnikova has said. But I will stick more to what I think are the most important stakeholders in China's soft power in Africa, and these are ordinary Africans. And it is quite important that there is a popular backlash, so to say, from Africans who are very frank in terms of their assessment of China's soft power in Africa. In my own native country of Zambia, we have seen that there is a willingness occasionally by the Chinese government and Chinese diplomats as well to actually hearken to the outrage of Zambian nationals. And it is because in a democratic country like Zambia, well, now we are squandering our democracy, but at the best of our times, our elections are really credible. And the Chinese know very well that if the Zambian government has to serve at the invitation of ordinary Zambians, then it will have to listen to the outrage of Zambian nationals. And much of that has been towards China, which is actually our biggest source of external debt. Today, Zambia's debt stands at 25% of the country's GDP, and 30% of that is actually owed to China. That is why even last year, when there was an outrage about Chinese labor abuses in Zambia, the Zambian government, in a sort of inexplicable way, took sides with the Chinese against the mayor of the capital city of Lusaka, who called out these abuses. So, but then that actually caused an uproar from ordinary Zambians, and I think it might influence to some extent the voting patterns going into the August 12th elections in Zambia that will be held. So, of course, I will end as well with. Apart from just giving the reception of China. So the main point there is that there is a dissonance sometimes between what the elite seek to promote and what is felt at a popular level. And most of the time, we should also know that even the elite themselves, they go to China because it gives them respite from Western censure and criticism. For example, in 2007, at the European Union Africa Union meeting in Lisbon, in Portugal, the previous president of Zambia was actually pressed on this the issue of China. And his response was, "We went to China because you in the West turned our back on us." Robert Mugabe in 2015 at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation said, well, China is doing what the West should have been doing because they're the ones that colonized us, but they're not taking any responsibility. So this shows that China is actually an escape mechanism, not because we're actively following it, but sometimes, yes, we initiate all these things, but we do that sometimes out of desperation. And that is why it is important to reiterate Dr. Repnikova's point that when it comes to culture, we are still enamored by the West and not by China. I will leave it there and then invite questions. Once again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Matambo. The two of you together paint an extremely complex, rapidly evolving picture. Not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions coming in. Again, if you would like to ask a question, send it to china@wilsoncenter.org. Our first question comes from Andrew Bella at Yale, and it's for Professor Repnikova, but you should both feel free to weigh in. This can be a free-flowing discussion. The question is, when you were describing Ethiopian reactions to Confucius Institutes, You mentioned that some Ethiopians were initially hostile to these institutes as part of, quote, China's empire. Have you witnessed similar reactions to economic projects led by China, like the Belt and Road, or do Ethiopians look at economic engagement in different terms?
Are we going to do one by one or just yeah.
Let's go one by one, because a lot of these questions are long. Not surprisingly, okay. We're looking at an entire continent here,
sure, I'll keep it brief, and Dr. Mutombo, if you want to step in as well. I was referring to the empire. The empire reference was actually from Zambia and Kenya. It wasn't from Ethiopia. So in the case of Ethiopia, there wasn't this kind of framing of China as an empire, when it comes to Confucius Institutes. In fact, they were relatively welcomed on university campuses, and some deans and university presidents have initiated these partnerships themselves. Once they heard that their jobs associated with these opportunities, they ended up lobbying for these kind of relationships through the main Confucius Institute based in Addis Ababa. So I didn't see this sort of empire reference to that, but actually the more critical comments tend to be associated with economic projects. So the BRI initiatives, the debt, and kind of the cost, the high cost of this sort of projects. Light rail across Addis Ababa, for instance, is one of these projects, this sort of subway system that's above ground, that's very expensive, and that's also already having some issues with its operations. So there are concerns about the quality of these construction projects and also about the cost associated with them. How is this going to be paid back? But also the idea that Chinese migrants and laborers are coming in and they might be leaving or they might not be leaving. There's concern about them kind of taking over, and certain fears and also racialized stereotypes in both directions. There's a lot of alienation, I think, between Chinese communities and Ethiopian community when it comes to kind of living side by side. So this was my reference. So it wasn't so much to Ethiopia when it comes to CIs, but it does apply to BRI projects, especially in private conversations that critique China. Thank you.
Dr. Mutombo, anything to add?
Yes, when it comes to Zambia, actually, there has been a lot of backlash, and that it is because it is unfair to entirely blame China on that, because it has been also caused by the lack of economic growth, especially in Zambia in itself. And then the reaction of the Zambian government itself to questions about debt. In 2018, for example, it expelled the IMF representative to Zambia because he called the Zambian government out on its unsustainable borrowing. And up to last year, we did not have an IMF country representative. And of course, last year, when Zambia became the only country, the first country to default on its Eurobond of 42.5 million, the institutions such as the IMF and other possible partners of the West were actually concerned about giving money to Zambia because they thought the Zambian government would use that money to service its debt to China. So that has caused a lot of consternation, but especially amongst the populace in Zambia and amongst the opposition political parties. The Zambian government, unfortunately, is deeply into the China's orbit, and because of that, we cannot go to them for an objective reaction.
Thank you. The next question is from Lisa Poggiali at USAID, and this is about distinctions between Chinese government approaches and Chinese corporate approaches in Africa. It was mentioned that Chinese actors, primarily I guess government actors in Africa, don't spend much time or effort learning about African context or culture. This seems to be different for Chinese private companies, especially tech companies, which cater their products to African consumer tastes and desires. For example, mobile phones in Africa, Chinese mobile phones come preloaded with apps that are popular with Africans. Mobile cameras have different capabilities to detect darker skin, etc. Can you speak a little bit about this? Is this part of a broad Chinese strategy, or is it Chinese companies taking the initiative here on their own? Do you see a meaningful difference between Chinese corporate behavior and Chinese government soft power efforts? And maybe Dr. Mutombo will start with you on this one.
All right, thank you very much, Lisa, for that important question there. Well, mostly the Chinese workers on the continent are usually confined to these compounds where they do not learn English, are mostly where they do not learn local cultures or interact with local African citizens, are mostly, especially in construction sites. For example, if there is a construction project that is running for a year, for example, they usually build temporary structures, sometimes even permanent structures, and they come with their own chef, for example, who will be cooking Chinese cuisine and stuff like that. So that actually happens in that particular mode. But then, as I alluded to in my presentation, there is a shift in terms of how Chinese today seek to ply their trade on the African continent. While at the termination of their contract, or maybe the project is over, some of them choose to remain on the African continent to just do things on their own rather than pandering to the China strategy as it is. And those actually found almost everywhere on the African continent. And not only that, we have multinational corporations such as AVIC, for example, from China today, who are actually not enclosing their workers. But then I would be very reluctant, though, to say there is something like a strategy expressly promoted by Beijing. And Professor Howard French from, I don't know which university he comes from, but he wrote a book called China's Second Continent. And in it, he talks about how Africa's relationship with China will be shaped more by the corporate sector, the private sector in China, and individual Chinese citizens who are coming on the continent, rather than by any strategy expressly planned by the Chinese government. I think that is how I could respond to that.
Howard French works primarily as a journalist. We've had him at the Wilson Center, and I highly recommend his books, both on Africa and on China. He's doing a lot of very important work. Maria, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Lisa, for this question. I think the differentiation here is very significant in terms of the adaptiveness of Chinese companies and enterprises versus Chinese state. But in part, it's also because it's seen as a market, right? Africa is, as Dr. Mutombo mentioned, a major market for some of these Chinese companies, including Huawei, StarTimes, and Tension that produces mobile phones. So they do work really hard to make sure that their products fit, that they can make profit. And part of this work is done through localization efforts. For instance, StarTimes is almost 100%, I think it's like 90% employment is localized. So it's local employees, including translators, but also all kinds of other creative professionals who try to make this product as appealing as possible to African audiences. Same thing with other companies. Huawei has academies throughout Africa where they train professionals in their academies and then hire them for their company. So the effort is quite significant, but I think we shouldn't kind of also conflict this sort of company kind of market initiatives with localization of Chinese employees per se, right? They're not necessarily better trained when they come to Africa than government employees or cultural representatives. So I think the training is lacking from all directions when it comes to cultural awareness and political context that they're going into. But the way that they kind of carry out their business, because it is profit driven and they want to get a larger market share, they're more adaptive and they're localized better, I think, than maybe state-owned companies. But state-owned companies are also adapting pretty fast. So it's an interesting kind of environment to observe. But I think the distinction is important. And thank you for highlighting it.
Thank you. I've been remiss in giving you our email address. If you would like to ask a question, again, the email is to come to China@Wilson Center with the American spelling of center. So that is WILSONCENTER, Wilson Center, the American spelling .org. Our next question comes from Ambassador Herman Cohen, who is asking about the behaviors of Chinese enterprises in Africa. Do they train Africans for management and promote them into management over time?
Well, Doctor, you could go ahead.
Oh, well, I can only speak for some cases that I've studied, but in the case of Ethiopia, one of the tensions that I've observed is that there are jobs available for translators and sort of negotiators, but managers are much less so. It's hard to get promoted within Chinese company to a management position, especially when it comes to state-owned enterprises that deal with construction, infrastructure, kind of the major companies. And I think that becomes kind of a ceiling, right? Like, how do you go up from there? And many of these translators, they end up almost serving as managers, actually. They negotiate, they deal with government contracts, they even train some of the employees on how to produce some of these products, how to manufacture, because they need local language knowledge to translate, and then end up actually learning how to do it themselves. So they're really invaluable, but they're not paid as managers, right? They're paid as still kind of a translator position. And then many of them end up quitting and becoming kind of freelancers. So they negotiate and, carry out different services for different companies. But there is this kind of, I think, a limit when it comes to how far you can go within a state-owned Chinese company and how far you can really progress. And management roles tend to be filled by Chinese employees.
I don't think I have anything substantial to add to that as well. One is that in Zambia, the only maybe progress that could be noted would be in private enterprises owned by the Chinese. For example, if they have a textile firm, for example, then probably they could have a Zambian who is managing a branch of some sort. But then it is very difficult if it is a state-owned company for someone to have some career progress of any meaning.
Taking a slightly different tack now, we have a question about whether, for both of you, do you see opportunities for the United States and China to cooperate more in Africa? Are there areas in which we could be working together?
Well, when it comes to that as well, I'll go back to that substantial difference that I talked about in terms of diplomacy. One power, it depends with how the United States wants to engage Africa. If the United States wants to engage Africa with this pontificating tone, then of course there would be a lot of resistance, not only from China, but from Africans as well. But there are a lot of opportunities. For example, here in Southern Africa, where I'm based at the moment, there's a rise of terrorism in Mozambique that has been rapidly spreading through Southern Africa. So for a stable Southern Africa, we will need, for example, some military capacity. The United States has come up with this joint venture with the Mozambican military at the moment that will run for about 2 weeks in order to push back on the rise of terrorism in Mozambique, and that is needed because Mozambique has just discovered about 60 billion worth of natural gas, for example. So that is an important part there where both the United States and China could work in order to make sure that they stabilize the subcontinent of Africa through the working, it could be through military collaboration. When it comes to politics, unfortunately, it is very difficult to see how the United States could work in synergy with China. But then when it comes to economics, when it comes to military strength and the stabilization of the continent in terms of material outlets there, I think there is a lot of room to collaborate. But of course, at the back of the mind, there will always be these diverging political nuances, both from China and the United States.
Maria, any thoughts on this question of cooperation?
Sure. I mean, the collaboration over the Ebola crisis comes up frequently by Chinese, in conversation with Chinese officials, that it's one of the most successful efforts to actually collaborate between China and the US. So Africa and Ebola crisis in particular gets mentioned a lot as kind of this successful case study. But so health collaboration, I think the health sector is often presented as more hopeful, but that's also been kind of challenging from my limited observations on the ground with CDC work. Some of the American professionals complained that, as I already mentioned in my remarks, Chinese tend to take everybody to China for these various visits. They don't want to come to Ethiopia, right? They have this idea of kind of combining this training with cultural tours and making it about soft power. And the American approach is much more focused and targeted. So we come to you and we'll train you there. We don't have to fly everybody over to, Washington or another place in the US. So I think there's kind of also some tension about how they end up doing this kind of work. How do you collaborate, when part of this tour ends up being about, museums and Great Wall and other things as opposed to health. So there are kind of frictions in the techniques, but I think there is some space maybe to collaborate in that area. I think part of also maybe the more hopeful side is that some of these offerings by China and the US are complementary. So for example, the building up of infrastructure is good also for US companies. If they want to operate in Ethiopia or in any other African country, having more infrastructure is better than having less, transportation routes and so forth. So they see that as a beneficial aspect. And also in education realm, China focuses more on higher education, right? Kind of scholarships for university students. And USAID, for instance, does a lot of work with, children and tertiary education and secondary education that's often unbranded. It's kind of anonymous, but it's actually very effective. So there are sort of complementary routes. But does that mean collaboration? That's maybe a little bit too strong of a word. And I agree with Dr. Mutombo that politically, there's so much tension right now that even kind of claiming publicly that we're going to collaborate with China is going to appear as maybe kind of a losing point or a weakness on behalf of the US government. And that's unfortunate, but that seems to be politically the case.
Well, your answers are a good segue to the next question. And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Repnikova, and then go to Dr. Mutombo. The question is from Anthony Chetham at Tulane, who says, Emmanuel Mutombo mentioned Kissinger's view that US diplomacy is missionary in style and China's is more cultural in style. How should the United States change its engagement in Africa? Should it increase, decrease, or completely alter its approach to engagement with Africa? This, I think, is just an invitation not to analyze, but to offer policy prescriptions if you'd like to do so. Maria.
Well, first of all, I think we need to be a little critical of, as famous as Kissinger is, of his depiction of this different diplomatic styles. If we think about China, for instance, I don't think it's entirely cultural. I mean, one of my main points today was that it is very much material as well. It's hard power and soft power mixed together in this really fascinating package, but it's not really about culture for the most part. So I think that's not quite the right way to depict a Chinese sort of soft power approach. But is it missionary and should it be changed? Well, I think there is room for being more pragmatic, right, from the US perspective and providing more opportunities, not solely kind of focusing on ideas or values. And I think when it comes to like freedom of the internet or media, right, that comes as an important example of that. We often talk about the importance of free internet, but not everybody's buying into that when you have technologies that end up censoring and controlling information space, surveillance technologies coming from China. So just saying that free internet is good for you is not enough. There needs to be some kind of other arguments that are maybe more pragmatic. Why is it good? What kind of outcomes does it bring? What technologies can we provide? What access do we bring to people through our companies? I think there needs to be more steps than just discourse, right, about why some of our values are good. But at the same time, I think some of these values and governance sort of approaches are appealing, especially to civil society organizations. So we shouldn't dismiss them entirely. I think it would be wrong to say, let's completely transform and be like China. We need to offer something different. So, offering something that's exactly what China is offering is not going to work. And there are some people arguing that we should be providing large scale infrastructure projects and competing exactly in the same realm. I don't think that's effective because we simply cannot compete on the scale of China. So the offerings should be different. I think focusing on governance is still very important. Whether that's missionary, I think that's maybe a strong word. So maybe adjusting and combining more pragmatic offerings with ideals and values, but completely transforming and being like China is also not going to be effective or competitive for the US policymaking.
Dr. Matambo, any recommendations for the Biden administration?
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, under the previous administration, people usually say China did not have to advertise its appeal to Africa because it was just there for the taking. America was helping it. I hope that the Biden administration will help in that particular to change that particular narrative. I think the first thing is that most of the times we see not only the United States but the West be more critical, but without offering an alternative to China. Do not tell Africans, well, don't go to China, like what Rex Tillerson did in Ethiopia. People were asking their question, but what are you offering them? So if there could be some tangible offering to that, some alternatives, then maybe as Africans we could say, okay, this is what we see. This is the merit that we see in what the Americans and the West do whenever they are criticizing China. And another thing, of course, when it comes to the sharing of values, I think one of the disservices that the West does to Africa is to just pontificate to Africa and vilify some of the bad governance that we see in Africa, but without selling the idea that when someone's talking about freedom of speech, when someone's talking about democracy, these are not Western views. Unfortunately, the West is not very clear in stating that. I think it is a human view, it is a human yearning for people to be free. And China, unfortunately, China has kind of succeeded to convince, especially Africans who are ready to hear that particular news, that these actually are Western niceties. Actually, the World Trade Organization Director Ngozi Iweala in 2006 called human rights and democracy as niceties. So the West has not really come up to counter such views, because these are views that are being felt even at the higher echelons of African governments. So if they could be more emphasis on that, the fact that these values are actually universal values, they're not Western values, I think that could be great. Another thing is aid. I think the United States and the West has usually collaborated with Africa with the understanding that Africa is a poor continent needing aid. China, on the other hand, China is actually not a donor in Africa. I mean, most of the times it sells this picture of being a collaborator. It has all these interest-free debts, but then it does not characterize itself as a donor, something which Africans would find patronizing when the West does. So if only there could be more collaboration that is not only hectoring to Africa, collaboration that is not only aid-driven, but collaboration that is trade-driven, and collaboration that also looks at Africa as people to work with rather than people to work for. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great answer, very helpful. Have a question now from David Rausman. What happens if the collateral for loans projects in Africa is not turned over to China? And I think what this is getting at is what happens for with China makes loans for infrastructure development and they cannot be repaid, does China take over the assets? Do they renegotiate terms? What happens in those circumstances? So if you could, that's a specific question, but I'd also like to broaden it out a little bit. You've both been talking a lot about China's inducements in Africa. You've been talking about carrots. What about sticks? Because we see China in Europe, certainly vis-a-vis the United States, in Asia, there's a willingness to play hardball, to impose sanctions, to be involved in economic coercion. We see what has come to be called wolf warrior diplomacy, with Chinese diplomats lecturing and criticizing local leaders and in some cases even local populations. So in addition to this question about bad loans and how they tend to be treated, do we see many sticks used in Africa by the Chinese government? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to start. Thank you, David Rassman, for that question. Whenever I talk about China in Africa, I expect this actually to be the first question people will ask, especially with respect to what has been happening in Zambia. So I'll talk about that. Normally, historically, what has happened, for example, with the Tazara date in China, that Zambia had to pay for a period of 50 years, from 1973 to 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Well, there was talk about it from 2003 to 2006, and then there was no talk about it anymore. And a lot of people just think, okay, maybe China forgave Zambia that particular date. Now, what has been happening since the Patriotic Front, the current ruling party in Zambia, came to power, has been more troubling, because debt has been spiraling, and of course, there's this palpable fear that China might take over some state assets. Well, in most cases, what China does is what is happening at the Kafue Gorge in Zambia, and it might happen also with the Kariba Dam electricity supply gorge, where China embarks on what they call the BOT, build, operate, and then transfer, which means you build an infrastructure, you operate it for a certain number of days, you recoup the money that you are owed, and then you can now transfer it to local governments. That is one aspect. The second aspect, of course, as people have talked about in respect to Zambia, is that China would have state assets such as the Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation in Zambia, or the Zambia Electricity Supply Company. Now, with respect to Zambia, it depends on a case-by-case basis. With respect to Zambia, the constitution forbids the Republic of Zambia to use state-owned enterprises as collateral in terms of debt contraction and stuff like that. So what could happen, though, is what has been happening with the Konkola copper mine in Zambia, which is the biggest copper supplier, where you take it from an investor, and then maybe you try now to bring China in, because despite China's immense infrastructure development in Zambia, the gem, the holy grail actually is the copper that Zambia produces. I think we are the second on the African continent. So that is actually where the holy grail is. And a lot of people think as if the Zambian government's decision to unilaterally liquidate Konkola copper mine, which was actually owned by Vendetta Resources from India, is a backdoor kind of privatization of bringing China into the mainstream economy by making sure that it antagonizes Vendetta Resources, drives it away, and then maybe brings China into the copper industry. And with that, China would have access now to the biggest copper producer in Zambia. Now, the stick that China used in 2018, this was actually quite unprecedented. China was building an electric supply gorge in Kafue in Zambia through Sino Hydro, a state-owned enterprise in China. And then by the end of 2018, it had just ceased operation. It says it did so because of enduring difficulties. It did not say exactly what those difficulties were. They did not divulge that. Neither did the Zambian government. But then a lot of people speculate as though that this is actually China's way of telling the Republic of Zambia not to think as if China will always behave in a pliant manner that it always did, because now it has also realized that because of its own particular spiraling date to the G20s that I alluded to, that we cannot only always count on China to bail us out.
Maria, does China show a more coercive face in Africa at all? Do you see sticks used?
I think from my experience, it's more self-censorship that's the key mechanism of, I guess, subtle coercion, where you don't have to use sticks. You can just have, individuals and institutions comply with China's narrative. And I think media and information space is a really good example of that, where, you see, for instance, in Ethiopian case, I looked at dozens of reports about China over like a decade. There's been almost no critical reports or investigative reports. There are very few. And when you ask why or how, it's almost impossible to report critically or investigate Chinese activities, because partially they don't have access to this information. When they go interview Chinese embassy people or companies, they don't provide the access. But in part also, when a critical report does come out, on rare occasions, Chinese embassy personnel does come into the media, kind of companies or offices and threaten them, saying that, well, you're going to really undermine this relationship. It's a really important diplomatic relationship. So it's seen as kind of part of diplomacy. It's not just any kind of issue. It's part of this diplomatic relationship. So investigating or critiquing anything about China is considered to be very sensitive. So I think that's something that's actually quite powerful, and it seems to work relatively well, at least in societies where with more tighter controls on the media already. So I think the self-censorship is actually more significant, but also this idea that if you do something more critical, you might not get the opportunities again. So if you want to go on another training, you want to go on a trip, you want your friend to go on a trip, your secretary, if you say something critical, you're going to be gone. They watch this very closely. Chinese ambassadors, I think, are very in touch with local media coverage. They see exactly who's publishing what, and they take that very seriously. They're very sensitive to critique. So that means that anything you say in public space gets immediately kind of, reported or taken into consideration. So I think that's, a very powerful mechanism, the fact that you're kind of being observed or watched, and then as a result, your opportunities may be cut. So I think that's something to take into consideration, less sharp sticks for now, but more subtle self-censorship kind of shadow that works quite well.
Speaking of critiques of China's policy in Africa, we have a question from Tongele of Catholic University, who says that there are many indications that China is using Africa as a dumping ground for cheap products of very bad quality. Does it fit the Chinese government's soft power interests to block China's industrial and manufacturing growth in favor of Chinese industrial and manufacturing products?
If I may just start with that, thank you for this question, Tongeli. It sounds almost like you're echoing a lot of the critiques that come up, in my research about China being kind of this dumping sort of machine, almost dumping all this low quality products that came up a lot. But in reality, a lot of these companies are producing them in response to demand for low priced products, right? So one of the things that China prides itself in is this kind of flexible pricing system. You can have anything for a different price. If you want a higher quality phone, you can have a more expensive phone. If you want a lower quality, here's a cheaper one. So their explanation is that, you want to pay this much, here's the quality that we can produce it at. But it does produce or induce certain image that these products tend to be kind of, not always long lived, and sometimes they break quickly, and that creates kind of this rumors and I think sometimes sarcasm, but also a lot of venting about this sort of dumping. But I would be kind of cautious about seeing this as some kind of a deliberate effort by Beijing, government to dump products. I think a lot of it is done by companies themselves who are figuring out the market reach, who are figuring out what the opportunities are, and then they're producing specifically for that market. So that's something that Beijing has a very hard time, I think, regulating, because there are a lot of actors involved in this process, not the government alone. So thank you.
Just to put some context to that, to add to what Dr. Repnikova has said, that even in China itself, there are different markets. So when this is happening, there are no double standards about it. That is my observation. So in as much as there are Africans who could afford quality Chinese products, there are a lot of Africans who cannot afford those quality products. And it's happening even in China itself. The last time I went to China, we were told, well, if you want to get any gifts home, there is this specific market for quality things. And if you do not have enough resources to buy that, well, you have an alternative. So I see nothing sinister about that, because it has been happening in Zambia as well, and then in China, sorry. And then a study, I've just forgotten the author now, but a study done in Botswana, which has been one of Africa's most critical country when it comes to China, despite having diplomatic relations with China. The general attitude of the local population was that at least it is offering access to Botswana, people from Botswana who cannot afford to buy very expensive things. So this is an alternative. What I decry about is what I can call it's a sort of way of intellectual property, and Dr. Repnikova said it, where even attires that were previously made by Africans are now being made in China and then being sold back to Africa. These are traditional flowery attire. So that is what I decry the most, because that is killing the industrial capacity of the people that were exercising their trade in that particular venture. That is what I would decry. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question now that brings us back to Monday's very important opening observation that China has been involved in Africa for a long time. This is from Jim Feinerman at Georgetown University, who says, when I was a student in China in the late 1970s, there were dozens of African students in certain higher educational institutions, for example, the Beijing Railway Institute, or the various engineering schools. What has become of them today? So these past efforts that China has engaged in to educate Chinese doctors, Chinese engineers, who presumably were back in Africa building institutions, what role have those folks played over the course of their careers in shaping African perceptions of China? Have they played a role?
I'm happy to start. I will give a specific example of what happened in Zambia. And for more information, I think people can access a video online by Professor Jamie Monson about the Tanzania-Zambia railway line and about Zambians who were trained in China in that particular venture. Unfortunately, when it comes to TAZARA, it has never operated at an optimum level since it was finished in 1975. And a lot of people that were trained that side were not trained in any enduring careers or skills, if I may put it that way. Quite a number of them actually came back having learned how to speak, how to drive locomotives, having learned how to speak Mandarin, but there wasn't any deep skills exchange on the part of Africans. And a lot of them today, as the video that I'm recommending shows, there are actually very disillusioned about what became of them, because and that I think has to be blamed partly on the Zambian government and the Tanzanian government, not on the Chinese government, because we are the ones who know the skills that we severely lack, and for that we should be the ones pushing that, and not actually expecting that China would do that. But yeah, the context of the Tanzania-Zambia rail line showed that there was not really any meaningful skills transfer. Of course, I hope that with the increasing numbers of Africans now going to China, especially to study things like economics and technology, that will change, and that it will translate into more fortunes for Africa in terms of skilling its citizens. Thank you.
Maria, have you run into any of these returnees from the 70s or 80s in the course of your research in Africa?
It's interesting. I actually came across a lot of returnees from the Soviet Union, which had really deep affinities for contemporary Russia and continued to visit Russia, and had really, I think, formed a very deep relationship. I haven't come across as many returnees from China. I think that's something that's worth researching further, whether or not they ended up contributing in some ways, reshaping local societies. But I think, yeah, from my experience, I haven't seen too much of that kind of transforming into or transmitting into some kind of a shift in governance at a large scale. Thank you.
If I could ask one final question, a broad question. In the United States, in North America, in Europe, in many parts of Asia, there are pretty well established, very active ecosystems in which people are asking about Chinese influence. Think tanks, government people, journalists, folks in universities. There's a discourse in these other regions about the meaning of relations with China, about influence, about how to frame Chinese power, and we're very much all in conversation with each other. Do we see ecosystems of that kind, of concern about these issues, active ecosystems taking shape in Africa? And if so, what does that look like?
I'm happy to start, but you can go ahead as well, Dr. Matomo.
You may go ahead.
Okay. So from my experience in Ethiopia, the ecosystem was hardly there. It was hardly present because most of the knowledge production about China comes from the Chinese side. So these Confucius Institutes or trainings. So there was no China center in any Ethiopian university. And when discussing this kind of the need for this ecosystem, I think for the most part, I was met with kind of a very pragmatic response. What kind of jobs would that provide? Like, why do we need a center that doesn't, equip anybody with skills that would provide jobs? And I guess this was my naive perception of going there thinking, oh yeah, maybe it would be great to open a center. I was like, well, what is the center going to do? What are they going to train these individuals in? And a lot of these translators who have great skills in understanding Chinese culture and even politics and economics don't end up going into government jobs or education. So they're stuck, or not stuck, they kind of choose to be there, I guess, but there are also no incentives for going into other sectors. So they're kind of mostly working actually for Chinese capital, which is interesting. So they don't kind of end up, contributing to building that ecosystem beyond that specific bubble that actually serves China's interests economically. So that was my impression in Ethiopia, but I know that this varies a lot. I mean, Dr. Matombo, you're in South Africa now, right? So there's a China-Africa center there. I think in Nigeria, there's a center as well. So I think there are kind of bubbles developing across the continent, but I'm curious to hear from you whether you think there is a kind of a network that's being formed across different countries, or if it's kind of unique or specific to individual countries when dealing with China.
Thank you. I'm in an awkward position on this particular question because I work at the Center for Africa-China Studies, which shares the same building with the Confucius Institute. So I always have to make the substantial difference to say there is a Confucius Institute, which is a cultural component of the Chinese government, and then there's the Center for Africa-China Studies, which is at the University of Johannesburg, and it is a university institution expressly dedicated towards academic analysis of Africa-China relations. That is why what we're trying to push now as a center, and we're trying to create networks across the continent, although there are a lot of institutions there. But what we're trying to push actually across the continent now is this concept of looking at China's relationship with Africa as Africa-China relationship rather than China-Africa relationship, because we are Africa, we're an African institution that when we're analyzing China, we look at China from an African perspective. But unfortunately, though, what has been happening is that we haven't made much ground. For example, Stellenbosch University had the Center for Chinese Studies, the CCS. It was closed down a couple of years ago, and a lot of people are speculating that it's because maybe it received funding from China, but maybe it was against some of its writings did not find favor with the Chinese government. But that is just speculation. But I hope, though, that especially universities, journalists, and we have to go into these crucial sectors that China itself is making use of. Universities, journalists, and today now we have noticed that China is actually actively involved even with civil societies. So if only these kind of ecosystems could come from where the Chinese themselves are targeting, then I think that could actually be a very big plus for the continent.
I think that's a great note to conclude on. Thank you, everybody in the audience all over the world, for tuning in today. We will bring you more programming on this and related topics. And I especially want to, again, thank my colleague, Monde Muyangwa, and your excellent team for all of your work with the Kissinger Institute. And lastly, and most importantly, Dr. Emmanuel Matombo, Dr. Maria Repnikova, thank you for sharing your insight with us today. That concludes the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.